I've been talking about it for a couple of weeks, that idea of a stay-at-home recovery. It's a very different recovery than the one we would have been talking about 6 weeks ago. How does that change your economic calculus?
Well, as you can tell, I'm definitely working from home because my office does not look quite like this. In fact, I went back to the office for the first time in months last Wednesday, just to remind myself what the office looked like. I think this is something where time will determine whether this is really a long-term story or not, to the extent that clearly companies themselves have to look out for the health of their employees, worries about perhaps commuting to work each morning, crowded tube trains, metros, whatever. All those kinds of things are relevant. There's also an issue about whether people are all at work on the same day in the same place. Because if you're not arriving on the same day, the value of being in work begins to go down to a significant degree. But I think also companies have to look out for particularly their younger workers. If you're a graduate trainee joining a company and you're working from home, who do you speak with? Where do you learn to do the job from? All these things become quite tricky and might have some implications for productivity longer term. So I think there's a whole bunch of experimental things going on currently, which are inevitable given the nature of the pandemic, but they don't necessarily prove we're going to massively change things over the next 4 or 5 years, let's say.
Stephen, how does it affect the supply side of the economy? How does it ultimately affect the labour market? Because that's where the gaps are at the moment. It may be less with office jobs, but certainly in other areas of the economy, people are less keen to come back. Therefore, we have big gaps. We certainly have big gaps when it comes to skilled labour. Does what is happening now change the dynamic as to how we expect the supply side of the economy to come back, how the labour market to balance?
So I think one thing here is actually the openness of borders, frankly, and the UK probably is an extreme example of this, frankly. But given Brexit alongside the pandemic, you've got an awful lot of people who were working in the UK who've gone back home, whether their home happens to be France, Germany, Italy, or Spain, or somewhere else. And they're not quite so keen to come back, partly because of the uncertainties of crossing borders, which are much greater than they used to be. And one consequence of that is that you've got this sort of strange combination currently of people wanting to have staycations, having holidays at home, but at the same time, the workers that would actually support those staycations simply aren't there. So you've got some very strange things going on whereby labour markets are not working in the way that they might have done in the past.
So, Stephen, on the flip side, in terms of the labor market, there's also a different dynamic, which is how workers are going to bargain for stuff. So we're all waiting for wages to increase. We've clearly seen that with junior bankers, right, with all the big banks. But there also seems to be a narrative that they're going to argue for things like, I won't take a pay increase, but I'll work at home for 4 days. How does that, but it doesn't mean the economy isn't growing. It's just going to be different. And the feed through into wages and inflation will then be different. How are you thinking about it?
Well, this is tricky. There are so many moving parts here that I don't think anyone as yet has the full answer. I think a lot depends, frankly, not so much on what happens with wages, but rather what happens with productivity. In other words, if you're working from home, are you more or less productive than you would have been if you're working in the office? And some people we know have been more productive working from home, less in the way of disturbances, less in the way of perhaps pointless meetings that tend to happen in the office. But others perhaps have struggled because some offices work on the basis of the connections between the different employees. If the connections are not quite so easy to make, you're likely to end up with some kind of reduction in productivity. So I think a lot of this depends on the efficiency with which people are working, what sort of output they're producing when they're at home rather than when they're at work.
I appreciate what you're saying about productivity, but nevertheless, central banks are watching very carefully to see what happens with second-round effects. Are we going to see wages starting to follow other areas where we are seeing inflation? And some of those may be transitory. We simply don't know. But nevertheless, the second-round effects appears to be where central banks are focusing their attention. Will this new labour market, to Alex's point, produce easy-to-understand evidence of what is happening that will give those central banks the clues they need to make accurate decisions?
Frankly, I think it will not be straightforward. I think central bankers, like the rest of us, are facing much higher levels of uncertainty than they would normally be faced with because we don't often live through a pandemic and then come out the other side. What I think is true, though, is that there are certainly pockets where wages are rising more quickly than they would have done in the past. This again comes back to the openness or lack of openness of borders. if people could move across borders very easily in the past and they can no longer do so, then you may end up in a situation where the people who should be ideally in country A are stranded in country B. And as a consequence of that, they're not actually adding to the labour market and to resources in country A. And one potential consequence of that is that wages in country A will be bid up higher than would otherwise be the case. So this may mean that some countries are more prone to wage inflation than others, which in turn may mean that some central banks have a very different experience of inflation that might be true elsewhere in the world.
Well, about that, I don't want to open a can of worms here, but does that decrease or increase the risk of a central bank having a policy mistake?
Oh, I think the risk of policy mistakes has gone up significantly. It's not because central banks intend to make policy mistakes. That obviously would never be the case. It's rather that the uncertainty that we're faced with is much higher than would normally be the case. You can form one sort of scenario that says wages and prices are going to accelerate quite strongly over the course of the next few months, and take the view you have to adjust monetary policy aggressively in those circumstances. Another scenario would be to say, well, this is just a series of near-term supply-side shocks that will unwind as the pandemic itself begins to evolve or possibly comes to an end, and therefore the inflation will prove to be very short-lived. Now, those are two perfectly reasonable scenarios, but they have very, very different implications in terms of monetary policy.